In every neighborhood, there's a figurehead, someone who embodies the spirit, for better or worse. And in the upscale, seemingly serene streets of Maplewood-gated community, that figurehead was Karen Wilkins, a self-appointed enforcer of the Homeowners Association's HOA rules. To outsiders, she was a devoted member of the HOA, someone who worked tirelessly to maintain the order and decorum of the neighborhood. To the residents who actually lived there, however, Karen's presence was a constant reminder that too much power in the wrong hands could stifle compassion and even life-saving actions. The events that unfolded one fateful evening were so outrageous that they left the entire neighborhood stunned. It all started when an ambulance responding to an emergency at the home of Tom Jacobs, a retired firefighter, found itself blocked by none other than Karen Wilkins, the very person responsible for keeping the neighborhood in line. It was just another day in Maplewood, or so it seemed. The emergency sirens echoed through the quiet streets, a sound that was far too familiar to the people who had become accustomed to their peaceful suburban lifestyle. However, that evening, the urgency of the situation was about to collide head-on with Karen's unrelenting need to enforce HOA rules. And what started as a simple medical emergency quickly escalated into an absurd spectacle that would be remembered for years to come. At the heart of the drama was Karen's unwavering commitment to the rules, even if it meant putting human lives at risk. As the paramedics arrived, they quickly realized that there was a bigger challenge ahead of them than simply saving a life, a confrontation with Karen herself, who had decided that the ambulance was illegally parked in her designated parking spot. Can you imagine being faced with a situation where someone's life is on the line, but a stubborn individual is more concerned about parking etiquette than the urgent medical care someone needs? This wasn't just about a misunderstanding over parking spots, it was a battle between human decency and the unfathomable belief that personal entitlement could override public safety. The clash of ego and empathy. As Marcus, one of the paramedics, tried to do his job, he was greeted by Karen's outrageous demands. She was no longer the mild-mannered HOA member but an obstinate figure determined to control every aspect of the neighborhood, including when an ambulance should park. What ensued was nothing short of shocking. Karen's demand to have the emergency vehicle removed and her call to 911 to report the paramedics for violating HOA rules would soon become the highlight of a dramatic and revealing sequence of events. This incident wasn't just about the violation of parking regulations, it exposed the ugly side of entitlement and narcissism that often hides behind the guise of community responsibility. As the tension between Karen and the paramedics mounted, the entire neighborhood started to take notice. What was initially a dispute over a parking space evolved into a public spectacle, with Karen filming herself and live-streaming the events for all to see, believing that she was in the right. This decision, however, would soon be her undoing. What she didn't realize was that the very community she had dominated for so long was about to rise against her, not just because of her actions on that day, but because of the years of tyrannical rule she had subjected them to. At that moment, Karen's authority crumbled before her very eyes. She had always believed she was in control of her neighbors, but this time it was her blatant abuse of power that led to her downfall. The neighborhood, once passive in the face of her commands, finally saw through her pretense of upholding rules for the greater good. This clash wasn't just about parking. It was about how power can corrupt, how one person's sense of superiority can make them completely blind to the needs of others. And most importantly, it was about how a community of people, when finally united, could challenge that power and restore fairness and decency. From ridicule to reckoning, the fall of Karen Wilkins. As Karen continued to escalate the situation by calling the police and live-streaming her irrational complaints, the tension in the air grew thicker. The paramedics, doing their best to focus on the emergency, were caught in the crossfire of a battle that had nothing to do with the patient they were trying to save. Meanwhile, Karen's self-righteous ranting would soon be exposed for what it was, an embarrassing display of entitlement that would backfire spectacularly. But here's the twist: as the officer arrived on the scene, it wasn't just the ambulance crew that was put to the test. Karen's facade began to crack, and what was once a carefully constructed image of the neighborhood enforcer was about to be shattered in front of everyone. Officer Daniels, called to mediate the situation, had seen his fair share of outrageous complaints, but this one was unlike any he had ever encountered. His reaction to Karen's absurd demands was both surprising and deeply satisfying. A lesson in humility. As the police officer listened to Karen's tirade, he quickly saw through the veil of self-importance that Karen had wrapped herself in. The idea that she could call 911 on an ambulance in the middle of a medical emergency for blocking a parking spot was something so outrageous, so off the wall, that it was hard to take seriously at first. But as Karen's stubbornness persisted, the entire neighborhood turned against her, led by their shared frustration at her tyranny. In a moment of irony that no one could have predicted, Karen, who had spent years policing her neighbors, was about to experience the ultimate karma. The reality of her actions would soon set in, and she would learn that community and compassion ultimately mattered more than her HOA rules. This video will take you through Karen's downfall, from her self-righteous outbursts to her public humiliation and eventual removal from her HOA position, all in the span of just one event. But beyond the drama, it's a powerful reminder of how unchecked entitlement can damage communities, how standing up for what's right can bring people together, and how a single moment can expose everything. Stay tuned as the real consequences of Karen's actions unfold. This is a story you won't want to miss. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the Maplewood gated community could be cut with a knife. People were peeking out of their windows and gathering on their porches, watching with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Karen, never one to shy away from making a scene, stood in the middle of the street, hands on her hips, phone raised high as she continued to stream her righteous indignation to her followers. But what she didn't realize was that she was losing control, and it was happening right before her eyes. The paramedics, Marcus and Lisa, were still inside the Jacobs home, working to save Tom, a retired firefighter who had collapsed in the living room. Time was of the essence. Every second mattered. But instead of rushing to help, Karen had turned this life-saving mission into a circus. Meanwhile, her neighbors were watching in stunned silence, some shaking their heads, others in disbelief at the absurdity of the situation. What started as a self-absorbed protest over parking was now a full-blown spectacle that was going to cost Karen more than just a few neighbors' respect. Karen, however, was determined. She had always prided herself on being the unofficial ruler of the community, the one who held the ultimate authority when it came to enforcing the rules, no matter how trivial they might be. But her behavior, her unwarranted insistence on enforcing HOA rules, was starting to unravel her carefully constructed image. This wasn't about parking anymore, this was about power and control, and Karen was losing both in dramatic fashion. The arrival of Officer Daniels. Just when Karen thought she had won, she saw the flash of police lights in the distance. The arrival of Officer Daniels, a seasoned police officer with years of experience dealing with neighborhood disputes, seemed to cause Karen's resolve to falter. She had expected someone to come and back her up, to reinforce her sense of entitlement, but instead, Daniels had no patience for her nonsense. The moment Officer Daniels stepped out of his patrol car, he took one look at Karen, the ambulance, and the situation at hand, and knew exactly what he was dealing with. A case of utter entitlement that was dangerously obstructing an emergency response. As he approached Karen, his expression showed a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. He had seen countless absurd complaints in his career, but this one was in a league of its own. "Ma'am, are you serious right now?" Officer Daniels asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "You want me to ticket an ambulance for saving someone's life?" At that moment, Karen's facade of authority began to crumble. The officer's words hit her like a sledgehammer, and for the first time, she was forced to confront the reality of her actions. But even then, Karen wasn't ready to back down. She tried to justify her ridiculous request by insisting that the rules must be followed, but Daniels, unamused and increasingly irritated, saw right through her. Public exposure and the end of an era. The officer wasn't having it. He let out a deep sigh, addressing Karen in front of everyone. "You called 911 on an ambulance. You were impeding an emergency response, and you're lucky I'm not charging you for it. This is the dumbest complaint I've ever heard." At that moment, the crowd that had gathered around the scene exploded with laughter. They had been watching the entire spectacle unfold, and now they saw an opportunity to publicly humiliate Karen for the ridiculousness of her behavior. No longer did Karen have the support of her neighbors. She was an outcast, the target of their mockery and disbelief. But the real kicker came when Karen, in a final act of defiance, turned to her phone, ready to stream the next chapter of her drama. She started filming herself again, this time directing the camera at the paramedics and the police officer. But this time she wasn't getting the attention she expected. Instead of support, her stream quickly turned into a viral spectacle of its own. People who had once stayed silent in the face of her tyranny were now using social media to share the absurdity of the moment. "You called 911 on an ambulance," the comments read, pouring in faster than Karen could comprehend. The video spread like wildfire, quickly gaining thousands of views. Every word she said, every foolish statement, was being broadcast for the world to see. Karen was about to experience the most public humiliation of her life. The moment of truth, Karen's fall from grace. As if the public exposure wasn't enough, the crowd outside began to turn on her. Neighbors who had once feared her now gathered in small groups, mocking her actions and celebrating her downfall. Every laugh, every raised eyebrow, and every phone camera flashing in her face chipped away at her resolve. Karen was no longer in control. The very community she had tried to dominate was now rallying against her. It wasn't long before the ultimate consequence of her actions arrived. The HOA board, which Karen had ruled with an iron fist, had received a complaint about her behavior, and the board members were preparing to take action. The public outcry had become too much for even the HOA to ignore. They had to address the issue, and Karen was about to face the consequences of her actions. As Karen paced back and forth in her front yard, fuming with rage, she had no idea what was coming next. It wasn't just about the neighbors turning against her. It wasn't just about her reputation being torn apart. It was about to get much worse. The next day, the HOA's final verdict. The following evening, an emergency HOA meeting was called to address the growing tension in the community. The board, led by Mr. Langford, had been working behind the scenes to make a decision. What would happen to Karen? Could she continue to wreak havoc on the neighborhood, or was this the end of her reign? As the meeting began, Karen entered with a sense of misplaced confidence, expecting her usual victory lap. But what she didn't know was that the tables had turned. The same community she had once controlled was now prepared to hold her accountable for the chaos she had created. And just like that, the moment of reckoning arrived. Stay tuned to see how Karen's downfall unfolds in the most unexpected way. In the next chapter, Karen faces the consequences of her entitlement, and the community of Maplewood finally finds peace, but at what cost? The repercussions of her actions will have a lasting impact on the entire neighborhood. This is a story of community, justice, and karma, where a single incident reveals the hidden cracks in a seemingly perfect world. The tension in Maplewood gated community was palpable the next morning. Karen Wilkins, the self-proclaimed ruler of the HOA, had just received the wake-up call of her life. What she failed to understand was that her actions were no longer being ignored, and she was about to face a level of scrutiny and accountability she had never experienced before. Word spread like wildfire. The neighborhood buzzed with excitement over what had transpired. Neighbors who had once been silent observers of Karen's tyrannical reign were now speaking out, their voices rising in unison. They had had enough. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Karen's live-streamed meltdown had gone viral, becoming fodder for gossip, mockery, and memes. Social media was flooded with comments that shredded her image to pieces. Karen calls 911 on an ambulance. What's next? One user commented, while others took the opportunity to turn her own words against her. It was a public relations nightmare, and it seemed that Karen was finally getting what she deserved. But it wasn't just the internet that was on fire. Karen was about to face her real reckoning, the HOA board. The emergency HOA meeting, Judgment Day for Karen. The community center was packed, but not with the usual crowd. This wasn't a typical HOA meeting where residents discussed mundane matters like landscaping and parking fees. This was the day of judgment. The board members, led by Mr. Langford, were poised to make a decision that would shake the very foundation of the neighborhood. Karen, dressed in a stiff blazer, marched into the room, still clinging to the belief that she could persuade the board to side with her. Her binder of HOA rules was tightly clutched in her hands, and she was ready to fight for her position with every ounce of entitlement she had left. As Karen stepped up to the front of the room, the crowd's eyes were fixed on her. The whispers began, growing louder by the second. Former allies now sat in silence, no longer willing to back her up. The once ironclad support she had in the neighborhood was slipping away. Mr. Langford, who had been sympathetic to Karen in the past, was no longer backing down. His face was stone-cold, his patience worn thin by her repeated abuses of power. The board, finally fed up with her misuse of authority, had decided to take action. Langford's voice rang out calm but firm. We need to address the situation with Karen Wilkins. The air in the room grew heavier, the uneasy tension palpable. The board had made their decision, and it was time to confront the truth. The final straw, Karen's inevitable removal. As Langford read through the list of complaints against Karen, the entire room held its breath. One by one, atrocious violations were detailed: petty fines, unwarranted rules, and personal vendettas against neighbors who dared to live outside her strict standards. 127 citations, Langford began, for minor infractions including inconsequential complaints about mailboxes and Halloween decorations. Karen has made this community a nightmare. At this point, Karen tried to interrupt, defensive as ever. I was just following the rules. But Langford cut her off. The rules, he said sharply, were made to ensure the well-being of our community, not to punish people for trivial matters. You've created a hostile environment, and it's time for a change." The crowd that had gathered in the room started to murmur, some even nodding in agreement. For the first time, Karen realized that her reign of terror was coming to an end. She wasn't going to win this time, and there was no escaping it. The vote was swift. Every single hand in the room shot up in agreement to remove Karen from the board. Not a single person voted in her favor. Karen's face twisted in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't comprehend the reality of what had just happened. The same community she once controlled had just turned its back on her. The power she had clung to for so long was snatched away in a matter of minutes. Langford, clearly relieved to see her gone, addressed the room once more. "We have taken the necessary steps to restore order, and Karen will no longer be able to misuse her position. This community will thrive again without her interference." Karen's last stand, a meltdown for the ages. Karen stumbled back from the podium, her head spinning. She had always believed she could manipulate situations to her advantage, but now she was facing something far more powerful, the unity of a community that had finally come together to stop her. It was a reckoning, and she had no one to blame but herself. As Karen tried to defend herself one last time, it was clear that no one was listening. Her supporters had evaporated, and the community was done with her. The crowd erupted into applause, a symbol of their triumph, while Karen stood there in shock, trying to hold on to whatever shred of control she thought she had left. Outside, the real consequences of her actions were already unfolding. Neighbors who had been quiet observers for years now began to speak up, telling their own stories of how Karen had bullied them, misused her position, and created unnecessary conflict. What had started as a few isolated complaints about her behavior turned into a full-fledged movement against her reign. The atmosphere in Maplewood gated community had shifted overnight. Gone were the oppressive rules, the constant fines, and the toxic atmosphere that Karen Wilkins had cultivated over the years. The morning after the meeting, the streets felt lighter, as if a long, heavy cloud had finally cleared. The people who had once lived in fear of Karen's petty complaints and constant surveillance could now breathe freely again. As the neighborhood celebrated, there was a shared sense of relief. For the first time, the residents of Maplewood felt united by something other than fear, a common bond of freedom and community. Karen Wilkins, however, had no idea what was coming. She had tried to hold on to the last vestiges of her control, but it was clear now she had lost everything. Her power, her reputation, and most importantly, her position in the HOA had been stripped away. The truth about her actions was out for the entire world to see, and there was no escaping the public humiliation she was about to endure. Karen's public meltdown, social media exposure. Karen, still reeling from the events of the HOA meeting, couldn't handle the fact that nobody had come to her defense. The silence was deafening, and the weight of her actions began to sink in. She had alienated everyone, and the world was watching. She had made the mistake of calling 911 on an ambulance, a gross misuse of emergency services, and it had cost her everything. The entire neighborhood had turned its back on her, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the internet's reaction. The video of her meltdown, her irrational complaints about parking and disregard for public safety had gone viral. People from all over the country were mocking her, sharing the footage, and laughing at her. The comments were brutal. "Karen called 911 on an ambulance? Who does that?" one comment read. "She's the definition of entitlement," another added. Every time Karen checked her phone, she was greeted by another meme or another viral video showing her losing her last shred of dignity. It was as if the internet had united against her, and there was no escaping the trolls and the ridicule. Karen's final act, a last-ditch effort to regain control. But Karen wasn't done yet. No, she wasn't going to let the community have the last laugh. She had one final move left to make, a desperate attempt to regain control. That afternoon, Karen, in a last-ditch effort to save face, stormed out of her house. She was still furious, her mind racing with thoughts of revenge. She had a plan: call 911 again. This time, she would accuse the entire neighborhood of harassing her. Maybe, just maybe, this time the police would listen to her side of the story. With her phone in hand, she dialed 911 again. "Yes, I need to report an entire neighborhood conspiring against me," she said through clenched teeth. The dispatcher, who had already been briefed about Karen's antics from the previous night, couldn't help but sigh. "Ma'am, is this about the HOA vote?" the dispatcher asked, already knowing the answer. Karen, with all the delusion she could muster, replied, "Yes. They're trying to destroy me. I need help." But the dispatcher wasn't having it. In a calm, almost amused tone, they responded, "Ma'am, you've already called about this situation. There's nothing we can do. You're obstructing emergency services, and that's a crime." Karen was dumbfounded. Her final attempt to regain control had failed spectacularly. She didn't know it yet, but her humiliation was about to reach a new height. The patrol officer who had already been called to the scene was on his way. The ultimate public humiliation, Karen's downfall. As Karen ranted into her phone, the neighborhood gathered outside to witness her final moments as the Queen of Maplewood. Jake, the man who had recorded Karen's breakdown the night before, was filming once again. Neighbors were laughing, some of them even cheering at the sight of Karen's downfall. They had seen enough, and this was the moment they had been waiting for. The police car arrived, and Officer Daniels, a seasoned cop who had dealt with entitled residents before, stepped out. His expression was unreadable as he took in the scene. It was clear that Karen was clueless about the storm she had stirred. "Ma'am, you called 911 on an ambulance?" Officer Daniels asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes, I did," Karen snapped, her hands on her hips. "This ambulance is blocking my space and they won't move. I have a right to protect my property." Officer Daniels blinked and then looked at the crowd. Neighbors were watching, some shaking their heads, some smirking at the ridiculousness of the situation. "Ma'am," Daniels continued, "I've been a cop for 15 years and this is easily the dumbest complaint I've ever responded to." The crowd erupted in laughter as Karen stood there, stunned. Her entitlement had driven her to call 911 on an ambulance, and now it was being publicly exposed for the absurdity that it was. The humiliation was unbearable. "You're obstructing emergency services, ma'am," Officer Daniels added, his tone final. "And if you continue, I'll have no choice but to arrest you for interfering with an emergency." Karen's face went pale. She realized her reign of terror was over and there was no coming back from this. The end of Karen's rule, a final reversal. Karen was escorted away from the scene, her sense of control shattered. The neighborhood had seen her for what she truly was, a tyrant, a bully, and a woman who believed that rules applied only to others. As she walked away, the celebration began. Neighbors were high-fiving, laughing, and chatting, feeling free at last from the reign of terror that Karen had imposed for years. And as Karen's car was towed away, the entire community cheered. In the days that followed, Karen's social media meltdown became a viral sensation. People from all over the world were commenting, laughing, and sharing her public disgrace. She had become a cautionary tale of entitlement gone wrong, and her fall from grace was complete. As Karen stormed off into the distance, still clutching her phone, her humiliation was just beginning. The neighbors, who had long been under the thumb of her petty demands, were now laughing in unison. They had waited years for this moment, the moment when Karen's control over them would come to a screeching halt. But there was more to this than just a personal victory for the residents of Maplewood gated community. This event symbolized a greater truth, one that people all over the world could relate to, the dangers of unchecked power and the power of community unity. The revolution was more than a simple act of defiance. It was a statement to every neighborhood, every community where Karen-like behavior had become commonplace. What began as a simple violation of common sense had now exploded into a global example of accountability. Karen's actions were now permanently etched into the annals of the internet, turned into viral videos, memes, and posts that would likely live on forever. Her shamelessness had become a worldwide joke, and no amount of complaints or social media posts could change that. The comments under every video were filled with people who had experienced similar situations, who had their own stories of dealing with people like Karen, and they were now empowered by the thought that Karen would never have the last word again. The legal repercussions followed swiftly. After the HOA had removed Karen from her position, the media caught wind of her ridiculous behavior, and the town was flooded with inquiries about the neighborhood's bylaws and how they could have been manipulated. It became a case study of what happens when a community allows one person to gain unchecked power. Local news stations were quick to air the footage, and even national outlets picked up the story. Karen's poor decisions led to her ultimate downfall, and every second of it was documented. The final humiliation came when she was forced to pay for the unpaid fines she had imposed on others, and the tow truck that had taken her car became the symbol of the final loss of control. As her car was towed away, the realization hit her: she had lost it all. Not just her position in the HOA, not just her status in the community, but her dignity, her respect, and the fear she once instilled in others.